Prince Aegon. Those for Rhaenyra's hand.
So while I'm on the what if wave, I've decided to tackle another question I'm sure has been on many people's minds since episode 3 of House of the Dragon. Aegon and Rhaenyra are the faces of House of the Dragon. Aside from Rhaenyra and Alicent, these are the heads of Team Green and Team Black. You have Rhaenyra, the king's firstborn child and named heir to the Iron Throne for the past 20 years or so. You have Aegon, the king's firstborn son, the expected heir to the Iron Throne due to Westeros' value of male primogeniture. He's a reluctant claimant to the throne of Westeros, though after episode 9 it seems like having the crown isn't as bad as he thought. This is a sibling rivalry for the ages, and the consequences of it still affect Westeros hundreds of years later. But what if it didn't have to be this way? What if action was taken sooner and the wedge between families was never placed, and the beef was squashed before it could ever be well seasoned? What if Viserys actually listened to Otto's offer, and married the younger brother to the elder sister? Would the realm finally be at peace, or would the family find a new way to tear itself apart? As always, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and let's explore what could have happened if Aegon married Rhaenyra. We set the stage in episode 3. It's the second name day of the king's firstborn son, Aegon Targaryen, and the king is called to hunt to celebrate. During the celebration, the Princess Rhaenyra, King Viserys' named heir to the Iron Throne, spends time with herself. After the betrayal of her father and best friend, she's had a pretty strained relationship with her family these past few years, especially with the birth of Prince Aegon, who Rhaenyra believes her father intends to replace her with as heir. During the hunt, Rhaenyra is approached by Jason Lannister, who wishes to take her as a wife, but Rhaenyra isn't exactly in the mood for marriage, though proposals are to be expected. Even if she wasn't the heir to the Iron Throne, she is still the king's sole daughter. Marrying her is guaranteed access to the royal family, and most importantly, dragons, the flying nuclear bombs of the world of ice and fire. These betrothals, though, are a bit of a nuisance, and in the midst of this, Otto makes an offer to the king. With Aegon being the king's firstborn son, many expect him to be heir to the Iron Throne. Otto's older brother Hobart is one such person. In fact, he's the one who pushes Otto to try and push the king towards Aegon, even though the younger brother seems resigned to the fact that Rhaenyra may remain the king's heir. So before the banners are called, fires are spread, swords are drawn, and people are manipulated, Otto tries to take a more diplomatic approach. The king loves his daughter, and chances are he won't change the succession in favor of Aegon. But if he can't sit the throne, then perhaps he can stand next to it. He could still be king, even if only as a consort. Perhaps that would be good enough. Otto approaches the king and makes his offer. Like in canon, Viserys laughs, pointing out that he just turned 2. He makes it clear that he finds it ridiculous and that he came to hunt and not be suffocated by politics. In the original timeline, Otto gave up as soon as the king pushed back, but this time he's not going to be so easily deterred. Instead of just letting Viserys push this conversation to the side and avoiding it like he avoids all of his problems, he's going to tell him something he can't ignore. Instead of being sneaky and manipulative, he's going to be honest with Viserys and just tell him how it is. If he won't listen, then he's going to make him. He tells Viserys that he understands he doesn't want to talk about this today, but whether it's today, tomorrow, or 2 weeks from now, this conversation will happen again, with one person or 100. Princess Rhaenyra is his only daughter, and even though the king named her heir, her status as such is shaky at best. As his firstborn son, Aegon will always be looked to by others as heir to the throne. Belief in hundreds of years of tradition and precedent isn't going to disappear overnight because he said so. Most people already believed that Rhaenyra was just a placeholder anyway. With Daemon disinherited and Balon's death, there weren't many other options unless he wanted to pass the throne off to the Velaryons. Even Viserys admits in the canon timeline that he named Rhaenyra out of guilt.
I thought Rhaenyra was the way out of my abyss of grief and regret. But naming her heir would begin to set things right.
Viserys thinks about Jason Lannister during this, and how he just assumed that Aegon would be heir to the Iron Throne. So what Otto's saying isn't wrong, but he still tries to combat this, reaffirming that he is the king. It's their duty to follow his will. They knelt to Rhaenyra. She will be their queen. They have no choice but to accept this. He refuses to believe otherwise, or admit it, shall I say. Then Otto says something at the risk of losing his own tongue. If Prince Balon had lived, would you still have the same sentiment? If he were here right now, would you have still considered Rhaenyra? This angers the king, but still he reflects and acknowledges the truth. A truth which I go over in my What If Balon Lived video, if you want to check that out. The truth is, had Balon lived, he wouldn't have given Rhaenyra a second thought. No one would have. He had years to name Rhaenyra his heir, but never did.
And my father never wanted this.
That's not true.
He had 20 years to name the heir and never did.
He was just like most of these lords. He wanted a son, a male heir, and now he had him. Viserys had been second-guessing himself for a little while now, but he's not going to admit that here. Instead, asks Otto, so I should replace my daughter in favor of my son. Otto knows he's walking a thin line. He managed to make the king acknowledge what he's saying, but at the cost of agitating him. He's not going to push for Aegon to be named heir to the throne. He doesn't want this to look like a power play, despite all the logical sense this makes. So he tells the king he's not trying to replace Rhaenyra, but he wants the king to know that as long as he has sons, their claims will always conflict with hers. For hundreds of years, men have only ever sat the throne of Westeros, and naming Rhaenyra heir has divided the realm. But wedding Aegon could change that. It would cease the endless proposals for her hand, and bring her claim as the named heir together with that of her brother, the expected heir. He could stop the conflict before it ever truly starts, and brother and sister could rule together. He's only 2, Viserys remarks. He'll grow, Otto responds. So now, Viserys actually begins to consider this. He doesn't want to admit it, but Otto is right. There would be more lords like Jason Lannister, more men like himself who were so obsessed with the idea of a male heir. Despite that, he would never turn his back on Rhaenyra in favor of his son. He already took her mother, her best friend. What would happen if he took her crown, too? The least he could do is try to help her secure it. There was no getting rid of Aegon, or nullifying his claim. If God forbid Rhaenyra were to die before she sired an heir of her own, then by all means he was next in line to the Iron Throne anyway. So in all honesty, it was better to keep his heirs together instead of apart. This is what Viserys thinks of for the rest of the hunt. When Rhaenyra returns and they go back to King's Landing, things go similarly to canon. Rhaenyra is fed up with being bartered and is convinced that Aegon will replace her as heir. When this happens, things take a divergence from the canon. He assures Rhaenyra that she will not be replaced by Aegon, but like Otto did to him, he lays things bare for Rhaenyra to see. As a woman, her claim to the throne will always be under threat. Many will believe that Aegon should take the throne over her. His claim will always be strong. That's why he wants them to rule together. Rhaenyra will marry Aegon when he is of age. Rhaenyra protests this, obviously. At this point in the story, Rhaenyra, as I mentioned before in previous videos, does not like Aegon because of what he physically represents. Her father's obsession that killed her mother, the betrayal of Viserys and her best friend. And even if she were to ignore all of that, Aegon is still little more than a baby, which she tells Viserys. We saw how she reacted to Willem Blackwood in the canon, so just imagine how she feels about having to marry Aegon. It seems less like a joke this time around and more of an insult to her. Viserys repeats what Otto told him at the hunt. Aegon will grow. She tells him that he's the king, he could just make the people accept her, to which Viserys responds that even though he's king, sometimes his words are taken as little more than suggestions, something that Rhaenyra knows and does very well. But this is something not up for debate. Rhaenyra will marry Aegon and unite their claims to the Iron Throne. They will rule together, and dragons will reign for hundreds of years. Rhaenyra is obviously not happy about this and thinks it's unfair for her to be married to a child. But this is Westeros, and child marriage is fairly common. Viserys married a child. Even though Alicent was legal by Westerosi standards, she was still just 15. Daemon also married a 15-year-old later on in the form of Laena Velaryon, and he even hit on his own niece earlier in the series, also 15 years old at the time. And now that I brought that up, I also find it kind of funny that this betrothal between Aegon and Rhaenyra kind of reminds me of Daemon and Rhaenyra, at least in the sense of age gaps. Daemon was 16 when Rhaenyra was born, which is likely the same case with Rhaenyra when it comes to Aegon. He's 2 and she's 18 by this point, so she might have actually been around 16 when he was born too. But only time will tell if the two grow to care for one another in the same capacity as the uncle and niece do in the canon timeline. Regardless though, let's go over some things that changed as a result of this new betrothal. For starters, by wedding Aegon, or at least being engaged to him, Rhaenyra never has her royal tour to find a suitor, which means no lords are openly insulted by the princess. And this guy, Jarrell Bracken, is never killed by Willem Blackwood for insulting him in front of said princess. Rhaenyra also doesn't need to marry Laenor to bring the Velaryons back into the fold later on either. And this means no strong boys or Harwin Strong. Rhaenyra having an affair in this timeline makes no sense. it will be over a decade before Aegon will ever be able to father children. So Rhaenyra has to be very careful. If she gets pregnant too early and people find out, there is no covering it up. But moving on. Things go similarly to canon for a bit. Rhaenyra is still upset about having to marry Aegon, and Alicent is trying to be as supportive as possible towards Rhaenyra. The two have mended their friendship like in canon, and Alicent tries to make Rhaenyra more comfortable with the idea of marrying her son. We'll even say that during these past few months, Alicent has even tried to get Viserys to reconsider his decision, but that didn't pan out too well. Regardless though, Daemon still returns and he and Rhaenyra still sneak out like in canon. Viserys finds out and he and Daemon have an out. Daemon remarks that Aegon is only a child, and it's better if Rhaenyra wed a man like him. Viserys, of course, is furious, refuses this, and sends Daemon away. Rhaenyra still sleeps with Criston Cole and gets the Moon Tea. Otto still gets exiled because Rhaenyra says he's a snake, and Lionel Strong is named Hand of the King. From here, things change a fair bit more. With Rhaenyra being engaged to Aegon, this also means he'll never get engaged to Helaena years later. This also means that House Targaryen never reconciles with the Velaryons in this timeline, at least for the time being. Laenor is not going to wed Rhaenyra, so the wedding you see in episode 5 does not happen. And since that doesn't happen, Joffrey Lonmouth actually isn't killed. He's not there to taunt a mentally unstable Criston Cole and get his face smashed in like a pumpkin. Daemon doesn't have an excuse like his niece's wedding to waltz back into his family's lives, so it's likely that after the death of his wife, Lady Rhea Royce, he actually takes up roost on Runestone until he gets kicked out by Lady Jane. Since there's no wedding this time around, this also means that Daemon never meets Laena at the party. But that doesn't mean that they don't get together later on. One way or another, that does still happen. Alicent also still finds out about Rhaenyra sleeping with Criston, which upsets her, but she doesn't make a flashy declaration of war like she does in the canon timeline. For a couple reasons. One, because there's no wedding or upscale event for her to do it at. Two, in this timeline, she also hasn't been manipulated to the same degree as she was in the original timeline by Otto. It's easy to see Otto as this guy who just wants power and power only, but that's not the case. He won't take risks unless he deems it absolutely necessary. This is proven in episode 3. While he does believe in tradition and precedent set by Westeros, Otto seems resigned to the fact that Rhaenyra will be queen, until his brother Hobart pushes him to do otherwise. And when this happens, he doesn't immediately plot to get Aegon on the throne. He tries to get Viserys to engage him to Rhaenyra first. It's only after his proposal fails that he begins to plot and manipulate Alicent into believing that Rhaenyra will kill Aegon and that Aegon must be king. But that changes with the two of them now being betrothed. Aegon will be king, just not the main monarch, and his children with Rhaenyra will be heirs to the Iron Throne. And if anything were to happen to her before then, he's still the heir after her. So this time around, he doesn't have much need to poison Alicent against her best friend, especially since in this timeline, Rhaenyra won't be birthing any bastards anytime soon, which would go a ways to making her seem unfit for the crown. But I digress. Alicent will still be fairly upset with Rhaenyra for cheating on her son, and their relationship will be strained for a bit, but there is not much they can do about it since with Rhaenyra being engaged to Aegon, she's essentially forced to be around them. In canon, Rhaenyra doesn't interact with her half-siblings, and I'm unsure if she actually even sees them as family to begin with. But in this timeline, to ensure good relations, Viserys kind of forces her to interact with them, Aegon specifically. In this timeline, instead of growing up and having the expectation of him being king forced down his throat, he grows up with the knowledge that Rhaenyra will be his queen one day, and he her consort. So this time around, from birth, Aegon is prepared to rule by Rhaenyra's side. It's much more natural and organic than him just being slapped around for things he doesn't even care about. There may still be some resistance towards being a leader, but with the knowledge that Rhaenyra will be the main monarch, I doubt he'll have much protest to this. Now, I suppose the bigger question here is, would Aegon even want to marry Rhaenyra when he's of age? Well, it's honestly very possible. Aegon doesn't seem to mind older women from my knowledge, and the only time we ever see him resistant to a woman is Helaena. He doesn't like her because he can't understand her, so he thinks she's weird and an idiot. Rhaenyra, on the other hand, is different. She's perfectly capable and intelligent, at least in Aegon's eyes. In this timeline, with Rhaenyra kind of having to help raise her husband, and assuming Viserys is still neglectful like in canon, it's very possible Aegon could start to view her like a second mother. Perhaps this will even be a repeat of Rhaenyra and Daemon. As mentioned earlier in the video, this scenario actually does resemble them. Daemon was 16 when Rhaenyra was born. Rhaenyra was around the same age when Aegon was born. Daemon and Rhaenyra seem to have taken a mutual interest in one another early on in the story. By that time, Daemon was in his 30s and Rhaenyra was around 15. I mentioned in my video on Daemon and Rhaenyra's relationship that I believe that Rhaenyra likes Daemon because she finds everything in him that she doesn't get in Viserys. She looks for her father in another man, and he gives her everything that Viserys doesn't. This makes it easy for Rhaenyra to latch onto him, become infatuated with him, and ultimately fall in love with him. The same could happen with Aegon. By the time he turns 14 and is ready to marry, Rhaenyra will be in her 30s, and depending on how she treated him growing up, we could very well have a Rhaenyra and Daemon 2.0. He could become infatuated with her the same way she was infatuated by their uncle. Or maybe Aegon will hate the idea of marrying a woman old enough to be his mom, but with how this family functions, it's highly unlikely. Moving on though, you still have the funeral at Driftmark. Daemon married Laena and had Baela and Rhaena before she died in childbirth. Laenor is here accompanied by Joffrey Lonmouth since he wasn't killed this time around. Aemond still claims Vhagar. There's still a fight in the tunnel, but just between Baela, Rhaena, and Aemond this time. Aemond doesn't lose his eye since no one brought a knife and there are no strong boys to provoke. This is just disregarded as a spat between kids. Rhaenyra and Daemon still sleep together, but this is just a fling and the first time Rhaenyra has had sex in years. Otto also isn't around during any of this. Since Rhaenyra never sleeps with Harwin, Lionel never has to cover for him. Since she has no bastards by Harwin, Criston Cole can't pick on them and provoke Harwin into confrontation, which doesn't get him sent back to Harrenhal. So we'll say that in this timeline they live since they don't get involved with the princess, and Alicent doesn't want her father back so bad that Larys takes it as an excuse to kill them. So Lionel is actually here on Driftmark instead of Otto. But moving on once again. Since Laenor isn't married to Rhaenyra, the Velaryons and the main branch of the Targaryen family are still at odds a bit. It seems like the only reason the king and his family are here is to support Daemon, but Viserys does have some ulterior motives. Lyonel Strong, the hand of the king, has always believed that House Velaryon makes better friends than enemies, suggesting that Viserys marry Laena, and then when that fails, suggesting that Rhaenyra marry Laenor. In this timeline, Rhaenyra married Aegon, or is at least engaged to him for the time being. The Targaryens have never officially made amends with the Velaryons. Daemon's marriage to Laena doesn't count since he's always been a bit of a free agent. So in an attempt to bring the Velaryons back into the fold, assuming that Laenor is still unmarried during this time, King Viserys suggests that Laenor marries his daughter, Helaena, who is unwed in this timeline. Sorry to all you Helaeman shippers out there. Corlys accepts this offer. His son can finally have heirs of his own, and when those heirs are born and grown, it's entirely possible for them to marry back into the main family through Rhaenyra and Aegon's children when they have them. So a good thing comes from a sorrowful day. Fast forwarding from here, I'd say things go pretty peacefully. Rhaenyra and Aegon are married, and they now have two sons, Jaehaerys and Jacaerys. Helaena is married to Laenor, and we'll also say in this timeline, Aemond also gets married to Rhaena at some point. Viserys still dies, but his family is more unified than ever before. Rhaenyra and Aegon are crowned king and queen of the Seven Kingdoms, and assuming nothing goes wrong, like Aegon getting power hungry, Daemon trying to start trouble, rebel lords, Otto coming back and trying to make Aegon the main power in Westeros, things could be looking up for House Targaryen. Aegon and Rhaenyra's children could marry Laenor and Helena's, or maybe even Aemond and Rhaena's. Dragons will reign and their seeds will continue to spread. We may even get a few cadet ranches here and there. Hopefully they aren't like the Blackfires though, because that could be catastrophic, especially if they have dragons. With that being said though, hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you guys have what if ideas of your own, feel free to leave them in the comments. If I find it interesting and feel like it's something I can work with, I'll consider giving it a crack on the channel. Even if I don't, I still look forward to seeing what you guys can come up with. Other than that, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and I will see you all next time.